All right. Well, hey everyone, this is Chris from DSX Machina, and I am with.
Well, I am Fred from How to RPG. I have a YouTube channel, covers pretty much everything about role-playing games, and yeah, I'm here to talk about a topic. What's that
Yes,
topic, Chris?
and that topic. Well, my channel, unfortunately, is just a scatterbrain of all my little rants and stuff. But we're talking specifically about the rise of a specific video game, the success, the meteoric success of Baldur's Gate 3. So we're going to be discussing why it's successful, what we are learning from its success, the consequences of that success, and if there are things that we can learn from both its impact as well as the game itself. And so we'll probably go through the whole roller coaster of everything, and we maybe bring up other games as well in the process.
Yeah, so my understanding is the idea is that Baldur's Gate 3 is a really big hit right now. It's tracking really well. It's last I saw it said something about it being one of the best PC games or the best selling PC games so far in history. And I'm like, is that history or just this year? I'm not entirely sure what's going on. Forbes has got an article out on this game already, and I haven't had a chance to actually read it, but it looked interesting. And also too, this game has been in development for a really long time. It had a play test of like 3 years, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's been in open beta. People could have played this game, and then there's been videos about showing gameplay of this for some time. So I'm surprised at how it rocketed up quickly. Usually, when a game goes through such a long open development process, when it finally launches, it's not necessarily a giant cataclysmic explosion as it is a now we just crossed that threshold. But it exploded seemingly overnight. Um, where its success lies in history, I think, yes, it is the most successful game of the year, probably the most successful game in the last 5 years. Whenever people say it's the most successful game of all time, I go, well, you do you really want to go up against The Sims? Do you really want to go against Super Mario Brothers? Do you really want to go up against games like Myst, which are these definitive games that you and I remember, but that everybody younger than us probably don't? But yes, The Sims. Yeah, I think you have to get to about. I think it's sitting at about 8 or 9 million. It's probably past that, which is insane for a game that's been out for less than a month. But remember, if you want to hit the Sims or Minecraft or heaven forbid Angry Birds, you got to get into the 40-50 million range, right? And you want to talk about games that made money just on income, you're never going to touch League of Legends. But that's beside the point. So anyway, it's still a huge success.
So its impact really in terms of the video game market is pretty obvious. We can see that right now. But there's also the issue around, right, the impact it will have on the Dungeons and Dragons brand, because that's like the biggest role-playing game out there, but also tabletop role-playing games in general. Um, what question do we really want to answer first? Because I've seen all sorts of tabloid question like there's a lot of people doing videos on this topic trying to cash in on its the hype and all of the news around it and the excitement. Um, but I guess the first question I'm more interested in is like, is this game really that good? Because I've never played it and I can't play video games because they ruin my life. I mean, what makes this game so good that people are talking about it?
Well, there's always games that are going to resonate with people. Was there a specific game that ruined your life, by the way? Is there what game touched you in the wrong spot there, Fred?
Mini games. I just have a very addictive personality. So
Likewise.
once I start, when I find a game that I like playing, World of Warcraft, and this is not even the online World of Warcraft, just a tactical game. I
Mm.
played that over and over on the console. Forza, I played way too much Forza. Wound up, so I start and I just get engrossed in those sorts of things, and I can't sort of separate myself. Instead, I've substituted that for running a YouTube channel on tabletop role-playing games. Instead, I let that ruin my life instead of sitting in a darkened room on my own.
This is the exact same reason why I don't, as well. Exactly the same as you, but I made a point to avoid. That's why I never got into. I haven't. I never got into World of Warcraft. I lost quite a few friends doing that. I did get into Tor, the Old Republic, the Star Wars MMO.
Mm.
6 months of my life gone, like 12 hours a day, and that's the reason why I don't. There are tons of games I wish I could play. I know for my future investment, the only time I'm going to set aside a week to play a game is if we get a new Mass Effect. If we get a new Mass Effect, I'll put that aside. The last time I played a game for like a massive length of time in one sitting would have been the Legendary Edition, which I played, I think, earlier this year, finally. So I'm in the exact same boat as you. And so as a result, I have seen hours of playthroughs of this game, but I have not played it personally. That being said, having seen extended lots of gameplay, seeing its interface, seeing its story, it follows a tried and true formula. There are very specific games. It's falling into a genre that's very well defined, and they're not really breaking from that mold, which is probably something that people like. It's doing something we all recognize very, very well. So if you've played any of the other previous Baldur's Gates, if you played Neverwinter Nights, if you played any of the offshoots or games that aren't D&D but still follow that same formula, for example, if you're a fan of Dragon Age, Origins or Inquisition, which I did play all of Dragon Age. And when I was watching these videos and remembering my time with Dragon Age, I looked and said, this is the exact same game, not story wise, but when it comes to its format, presentation, the way the interface works, even the way the conversation works, the fact that all the characters talk, you can hear the voices of all the characters except your own. Um, Very indicative of something from Dragon Age, but Dragon Age itself took its format from the previous games from the past. So we are tracking a genre that hasn't really shifted in its presentation for the better part of almost 20 years. But what this is a extremely good looking, well refined, and epically large version of that. This will probably beat Witcher 3 when it comes to people's impression of scale. Witcher 3 was known to be a very, very large game. But I think that's where the success comes from. It's recognizable and it does something really, really well.
Mm. So one of the things that I sort of noted about this game was it's not a hack and slash. So it's not just it's not Diablo. You're not just going to cut your way through hordes
Yeah, it's
of
not a loot and shoot.
yeah. You're not just cutting stuff down. Does have so a lot of nuance in it. You know, the voice acting apparently is extremely good, and I have watched some of it, and like the character portrayals
Oh
are
yeah,
very wide. I mean, there's a lot of
facial
dialogue.
animations are really strong.
Hmm.
But you're right. I love the fact that non-combat skills are a very big thing. I've not. That's one thing I'd probably say is probably the most novel mechanic because I've not seen that in previous games, especially even BioWare didn't address this with any other games. Your conversation skills were entirely your own. The idea of rolling intimidation, persuasion, or wisdom ability checks, uh, and in conversations and having that affect the gameplay and storyline. That being said, looking at these, I was like, my God, if you go in high persuasion, if you go in with massive ranks of persuasion, you can totally swing the game heavily in your fashion. Because I didn't realize how many times persuasion very specifically plays up into the game. That could have been the skew of the videos I've seen. I've seen about 5 or 6 hours worth, and people said that is a small number. But the number of times persuasion came up, I'm like, wow, don't if you know, which is hilarious because in regular pen and paper, usually not a lot of people sink in persuasion. But if you're playing this game, it seems that I think this also it's the same situation whenever I watch Critical Role and I talk to new gamers. It's like, is it like Critical Role? I'm like, no, it's not like Critical Role at all. Oh, is it like Baldur's Gate? No, it's not like Baldur's Gate at all. It'll if you're expecting that, it'll be a little disappointing, but it'll have its own strengths in itself.
Mm. So yeah, I guess the other thing that I noticed about this game is the world's very large. Like the world is huge that you're dealing with, that you can explore. The story's actually very good from what I've heard. It kind of throws you in fairly quickly. It's not
Yeah,
quite like James Bond where you sort of it's um media res, throw you in that way.
yeah.
But it does throw you in at least with a this is the background, what's going on, and you know behind everything else before your character starts doing their thing. So, which is clever. And let's get real, media res is one of the smartest ways to start anything. If you want to get people interested,
Yeah,
don't
you get
start
them.
slow.
Yeah, right in the middle of the action. There's actually quite a few games that took almost an identical format. This is a mild spoiler because most people haven't played the game, uh, but this is the first act of a very, very, very long game. But in this game, it opens up with you in the Spelljammer setting. You're basically on a magically infused living spacecraft, and this vessel crashes into the Forgotten Realms world as we know it. But it's interesting. It starts off with a Spelljammer, which is not a very popular setting, and then moves very, very quickly into the setting that we all know and love. But the spaceship was commanded by the Illithids, mind flayers, and the vast brunt of the primary story involves the consequences of that opening act, which means the Illithids and mind flayers basically play a major role in this story.
Mm. And I wouldn't say that that's a spoiler, because if you watch the trailer or you watch the very first part of the video game, the cutscenes tell you all that information pretty quickly. It's not really a spoiler as such, I suppose,
Yeah.
since it's pretty readily accessible. Also, too, I mean, you look at this game and it looks like, well, it looks like the tabletop role-playing game, doesn't it? Because they do all the maths, they put all the numbers in front of you, they even put the dice in front of you.
Yeah.
You know, you can see it all happening. Even when you're rolling advantage and disadvantage, it's rolling advantage and disadvantage and
I actually
pushing.
really appreciate that when it does the roll, it shows you all your
Yeah.
modifiers. So it shows you the die roll, and then it shows how your values and adjust it. I'm actually really impressed. Although I was a bit surprised whenever I see videos of people doing these, I'm like, wow, it's amazing how many modifiers. And I realized, I wonder how many players forget all of their passive modifiers that they don't really think about, that are situational, that they kind of forget because they have this big character sheet with all these numbers and are not fully aware of when it applies. Um, and seeing this game, and I wouldn't be surprised there's some players that are playing this and go, oh yeah, I forgot I could do that. I didn't realize that would be a situation this would pop up in.
Yeah, but also too, I believe Larian has taken some artistic license and they've actually modified and changed some of the 5e rules. So it's not just it looks like it's a complete port of 5e straight across, but it's not, because they have changed the way certain mechanics work, and so they may have added in some additional mechanics we're not aware of.
I'm totally aware of that. Yeah, there's
Yeah.
a couple instances whenever, once again, we're talking about these persuasion, these dialogue-based persuasion roles. And when I would see them, I would see the modifiers and I would look at this and go, what is that? I have never, one of the most notable examples is throughout all of my experiences. Now, this is being said, I have experience with the core books and a few things on top of that. I don't have a lot of experience with a lot of the brand new books that have come out in the last few years. But looking at what I know so far within the philosophy of D&D, there are not a lot of modifiers to your die roll, which is itself a roll itself. So when you roll your die 20, all your bonuses are static. I have not seen a lot of instances where you're rolling another die 6 and adding that to the die 20 roll. I've done it with my own game, my own publications, but within most of the books that I have read, I have not seen that. And I saw that a lot in this game, where you're doing a die 20 roll and one of the modifiers was another roll, either a die 6 or a die 4. That's something I thought was actually quite neat and quite novel. And I don't know whether or not that's a precedent that they are set, or that's something that's from the newer books.
Mm. Yeah, when I look at this, I think, well, somebody like myself who built their channel on explaining and demonstrating game rules for Dungeons and Dragons 5e initially, and now I've moved over and branched over to other things as well. Like, what the heck am I doing? There's really no point. You go play this game, you're going to probably learn most of the mechanics that you need to know, although they'll probably be the house rules that Larian's put into their game.
Yeah, and I think that's where the advantage comes in. Knowing, this is one of the things I want to talk about, learning about some of these ideas and going, that's not in the game. Should it be? And I think when we're talking about third party, there's tons of really weird things that third parties are offering. And I bet you Lorian has looked at some of these and went, you know what, this is actually not a bad idea, you know.
Mm.
And so it's interesting if they would ever give credit and go, oh, this mechanic isn't not a fifth edition D&D or official fifth edition D&D. We took this from Ultra Modern 5 or something like that. And that would be a cool little thing if they mentioned that, because Ultra Modern 5 is my book. But I do like their presentation. I do like some of their aspects. Oh, look at that.
Yeah,
I wonder how that got there.
this book shows up in a lot of my live streams, Chris. I have been saving it because there's a lot of material in here. So I think got about 3 months worth of character building and a review and probably a lot of other stuff. So it's
Always keep me
coming.
tapped in. I don't always get a chance to watch your live stream because right now I'm lasered. I'm doing layout for the newest Amethyst book. So yes, I know. I actually have one of them here as well, right here, but right next to my quintessence book because that's what I'm writing. But yes, I do like it, and like I said, there are definitely things that I think people can learn. I would love the idea of people because once again, being a democratized society, any homebrew rules that you recognize from Baldur's Gate 3, you can absolutely transplant into your own game. And if you want to make a publication where you basically copy paste those homebrew rules, technically you can do that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the copy paste completely is probably not it might be a little bit of a problem, but you just reword it right, and there
Oh
really
yeah.
isn't any problems in terms of the game mechanics, since game mechanics can't be copyrighted. You just can't use the exact wording, I suppose. The other thing I noticed is that this game apparently on release has no microtransactions,
Oh
and
yeah. There's a whole nother topic which we probably best we avoid, which talks about the um kind of marketplace importance of this game within the video game field. The fact that it breaks a lot of rules that were set only recently about how games were run. The fact that people say Baldur's Gate's a trendsetter, I go, no, it's not. It's a replication of a game that most people who are playing games now have never been experienced, have never experienced. Right? I go, oh my god, like no, it's an enclosed game with no microtransactions, massive length, and everything you could possibly want. It works out of the box. And I go, yeah, I hate to break this to you, but from the 1970s to about 2010, that's how all games were. These people probably under the age of 25 have never experienced a game that's like Baldur's Gate. And we're like, yeah, sorry to say that this is not a trendsetter. This is a going back to the good old days type of thing.
Yeah, and I believe that the crew, I mean, I don't know, is it 400 so programmers and so forth involved in this, but also just at the upper management of Larian, they're all very role play D&D nerdy people. So they're,
Which means
they're
guaranteed a small percentage of them probably are subscribed to your channel, which means I'll get better guarantee one of them will be watching.
Uh, well, that'll be interesting. I wouldn't guarantee that, but I thought that was quite amusing. There's no guarantee, of course, that Baldur's Gate 3 won't wind up with transactions, small micro transactions
I think we'll
later
see
on, but
DLC.
we'll
I
see,
think we'll see DLC. We'll see DLC.
Yeah,
Additional adventures down the road. I don't think we'll see microtransactions the way people usually look at the stigma, which
yeah,
is here are some skins and stuff for $5. But I wouldn't be surprised if they offered modules, dungeons, and stuff like that. And we were
yeah,
talking about before the video began about whether or not they'll allow third-party content.
yeah, yeah. And I guess the question that has to be asked is if this game does, as well as it seems like it will do, it's doing really well right now. What's likely to happen is if they have actually developed, and I don't know very much about video games, if they've actually developed an adventure builder, so you can actually build your own adventures with their game, like whether it's just like a combat simulator or you can do something a bit more involved, I don't know. But if they've done that, they're certainly going to ensure that this game has replay value. It's a long game already, so
Yeah.
and you can play it through with different classes, and apparently the story sort of runs differently. There's a lot of different endings to it apparently too.
Yeah, I've
So
seen a lot of those. So the official word is obviously that according to the CEO of the studio, it is unlikely that we will see an adventure builder for Baldur's Gate 3. And I wouldn't be surprised if this was a legal restriction for them to publish this game under the 5e license,
mhm.
because the moment people can make their own dungeon builder, you are effectively taking a lot of urgency away from their upcoming tabletop dungeon, virtual tabletop program. I was trying to figure out if there was a program. I could have sworn one of the previous entries in that series might have been Neverwinter, where you could actually create third-party adventures and then have players run it. And you could have one player being the game master that would look over the player's progress and insert with encounters and stuff. Basically, a predecessor to the modern VTTs. I can't remember which one it was, if it was Neverwinter Nights or another entry, but I clearly remember that being a thing, even though I had never personally did it. But yeah, it's doubtful Baldur's Gate 3 will do that, and it's unlikely they will, probably for legal reasons.
Yeah, I was thinking something like that too. I was like, why would you license out to this company when you know that you're probably going to be, I mean, the three-dimensional virtual tabletop that Wizards of the Coast is developing, it's probably been in development for years. Like it won't be something that just started a couple of years ago. It's probably been going for a while now, and it would be silly to create a competition for yourself. Who knows? I would imagine that Larian's probably got the capacity to release an adventure builder, but they just can't.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I don't think that's going to happen.
yeah.
Um, that being said, considering how adept people are now, I'm sure someone's going to find a way to crack it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're talking about the modding community,
Yeah.
somebody who figures out how to make that possible.
And
And
considering how successful it is in the industry, they would Lorraine would have to actually legally stop these from happening because they're going to find a way to do it. Considering that Cheat Happens generally puts out a cheat program for a game within a couple days of its release, like they are that good at creating the structure of modifying game structure. And if you can modify a game that quickly, you can create homebrew for it. So I think we're going to see modded content is going to, but it'll depend at that point whether or not they can legally allow it, because obviously Rockstar, they absolutely support a modding community. They tried to create a marketplace that didn't do very well because they were trying to monetize it, but it's still very, very massive. Obviously, Steam itself through Valve Valve itself have always supported modding, and they've even supported people playing with their own IPs without permission, which I thought was fascinating. So if we see third party homebrew content done by the modding community, Larian's reaction is going to be very telling because they're very approachable. Like they're very kind of in the fan. They're almost like the way CD Projekt Red was before the disaster of Cyberpunk, where everyone thought these were the cool guys. They were on our level. And if Larian kind of goes to the legal side and go, we're putting a stop to this, um, and people start getting angry at Larian for trying to close the modding community, I'll be like, they have to. Like, there's no way that they would go the legal route unless they were absolutely told from Wizards that they are not allowed to support the modding community. So if we see them coming down on the modding community, we'll know it's because they have to, not because they want to.
yeah, but this is another question, right? Because how successful has trying to control the modding community been in the past? As soon as you have a game, as soon as you have a game that isn't controlled by a server, that isn't run off somebody else's website,
Mm.
and you can actually just download it onto your machine, there's nothing you can really do. So I don't
That being
think
said,
that's gonna.
I was really surprised that there was a four-player co-op version. Like when I found out that Baldur's Gate 3 was co-op and that you could actually have a group of four real players all running a campaign together, that blew my mind because I thought there's no way WotC would have allowed them to basically recreate the tabletop experience by having four people. So they had to have gotten that through. And I'm like, that's the part that I'm the most impressed with. If someone were to tell me, "Hey, I'm buying Baldur's Gate. Do you want to run the campaign with me?" It would be very difficult for me to say no. I would want to do it. That being said, I know apparently you're basically joining someone else's party, and you're not basically running your own quests. You're following one person's story, which is not like you get a love interest and you get a love interest. If you could, I don't think that's possible. But if there was a situation where everyone got to enjoy their own stories, but they're all in the same group, I think that would for me, I think a lot of people are like, I'm not going to play D&D anymore. We're all going to play Baldur's Gate.
This is another thing that I think might well be what we are looking at, and that is because there is a multiplayer option, and
Yeah.
because there is so much diversity in terms of how the story plays out or the adventure plays out, And because every single class seems to have a different way of playing things out, I can see people playing through 4 times. I can see
Absolutely.
people joining somebody else's group, playing through with whatever characters they have with that particular person, and then when they've done that, playing through again. People do play through these types of games more than once sometimes, and particularly when they have a lot of nuance to them, they'll play through more than once. So I think that's very much a possibility. It also means that those people who have been struggling to find somebody who's a game master or a dungeon master to play Dungeons and Dragons or any kind of role-playing game, well, they can jump into a video game. It's easy. You don't have to worry about that one job that nobody really wants, the one that
I
requires
love
all.
playing a DM. I've been a DM. We were having this conversation
I know,
a
I
long,
know,
long
I
time
know.
ago. I'm one of those people that absolutely loves being a DM. I'm always running campaigns. But
Yep.
here's a quote from a publication. In the game Baldur's Gate 3, co-op players can more or less do their own things. This is surprising. If one player starts a conversation with an NPC, the other players can watch it and suggest dialogue options by clicking on them. But whoever initiated the dialogue or was the target of it if they wandered into a room and triggered an event makes the decisions. Control of NPC companions in the party is assigned to players in the session menu. See the romance section below for more on co-op and NPCs. Co-op players can also wander away from each other and do totally different things. One player can even be in a turn-based battle while another is exploring on the other side of the map. That's insane. I didn't know you could do that. That is so amazing and impressive and shocking. Even I want to play co-op that. I don't play VTTs. I don't play VTTs, but I would actually play Baldur's Gate 3 cooperatively.
Yeah, and it makes a lot of sense because a lot of people just want to play a character and nobody really wants to. I mean, there's obviously people like yourself and myself who are quite happy to be a game master, but there's a lot of people who don't because it's a lot of work and, requires a bit of organization and a bit of preparation sometimes, you know, a bit of guts, you got to throw yourself out into this thing.
The
Um,
irony of that is one of the biggest complaints we had this year, and you and I talked about it at length. In fact, we talked about this one thing for like an hour about the fact that Wizard was going to incorporate an AI dungeon master to remove the DM from the situation, and now everyone's clamoring for this game, which has an automated DM, which is of course the computer program. It's
yeah.
maybe not be an interactive AI, but it's still a situation where we removed the dungeon master from the experience. So I love the fact that everyone's praising this game, despite the fact that everyone was vilifying Wizard of the Coast not 6 months ago for promising to do exactly this.
Well, I haven't changed my view. I do believe that the artificial intelligence dungeon master for their virtual tabletop is something that they'll be considering
Oh,
trying to
there.
make. They'll be
Again,
doing.
I wouldn't take bets on that. That's absolutely happening.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
I love what this game represents. I love it what it represents in the marketplace. I like the fact that people will play it. We were talking about whether or not this game will bring more people into the tabletop. That's tough. Once again, it's the same reason why I think a lot of people play Critical Role and go, "Oh, that's what D&D is like. I got to get into that." I think if they'll play Baldur's Gate, I think first of all, I guess you would have to. We wouldn't see the lasting effects for probably some time because I think right now we're in a situation where if people are playing Baldur's Gate and someone says, "Hey, you want to play D&D?" I go, "Well, no, let's just jump into the Baldur's Gate." So we may not see I wouldn't be surprised if D&D took a hit, a pretty severe hit for the next few months. And then maybe come Christmas, we'll see if potentially it may translate into sales. I wouldn't be surprised if this is actually a hit for Wizards of the Coast, not a hit as in a good thing, but a knock against their sales. I wouldn't be surprised if D&D sales dipped over the next few months.
Well, I think their sales were going to dip anyway with their 2024 rules set coming out and anything
Yeah,
they're
that's
putting out right now. I mean, a lot of people,
outside of what they do to themselves.
yeah, I mean, out of their own self-destructive sabotage that they've been involved in. So yeah, I mean, they're going to take a hit no matter what. But I think I agree. I mean, once people have played through Baldur's Gate a few times, and they've got a couple of different versions of the adventure played through with their buddies and their friends, their mates and their girlfriends and so forth. They'll probably start looking at some, what else can we do? Can we keep going? And then maybe they'll look at the tabletop role playing game. But yes, I agree. I think they'll probably see a big hit initially because people will shift over and do this. I don't think it's going to
Oh,
happen for everybody. Some people like the social aspect. They don't
yeah.
like video
But of course, they
games.
get the social aspect with the co-op. That being said,
Mm,
we do know that there's a precedent for this because I think D&D sales will spring up eventually, and there'll be a net positive. Because when Cyberpunk 2077 came out, which is based on a very old tabletop game by Mike Pondsmith and Artel Zorian Games, Artel Zorian Games released Cyberpunk Red, I think, which was the updated version, and it exploded. Like it was number one in the Drive Through RPG for a very very long time. So that was a huge hit. So I think there was an absolute uh, uh, correlation between the success of that book and the massive exposure that the game got because of Cyberpunk 2077. That being said, the one big difference was the fact that 2077 was entirely, and it still is, a solitary experience. The fact that Baldur's Gate offers an extremely rewarding cooperative experience may change, may be the deciding factor in why Wizards may take a hit rather than get a boost.
mm, yeah. I think the other thing is it's an interesting concept to think. Okay, so I mean, obviously, we're probably going to see people who haven't played this video game, Baldur's Gate, before, because Baldur's Gate is quite an old game, the first one, and even the second one for some people. You'll get new people coming in to play Baldur's Gate 3. And then, of course, as we talked about, some may transition over to tabletop games. And of course, going back the other way, I think that's all. I mean, it's all speculation. What I think is interesting is like, is it going to cause like a division in the community, in the tabletop community, whether it's Dungeons and Dragons or it's any other role playing game? Is it going to create a more division than I mean, right now the community is divided as it is, as people are splitting off and not playing D&D and not playing different systems. That's been actually happening, and they've been moving away from Wizards of the Coast and looking at third-party publishers. I kind of wonder if that tabletop community is going to wind up fracturing more because of this game.
I actually think you made up a very interesting point there. That's actually a very good thing to think about. Well, there's a couple of things to consider. If this, because we were talking about the fact that there's a very decent possibility that part of the reason why the film failed was because of the negative feedback from Wizards, and I was contemplating that. I can't see that it being that many. Like we were talking about the Flash and people saying that the film bombed because of Ezra Miller. And I go, I don't think there's enough people that gave a crap about it, because when you have a film that has to make 500, $600 million, I don't think there's enough people that care enough to skew that. But when we're looking at would Wizards controversy and the hatred people have for Wizards that came about because of what happened earlier this year affect their sales? And clearly it hasn't. Baldur, if someone says, imagine if Wizards hadn't done that, would Baldur's Gate 3 sales have been changed? And I said, you know what? No, I don't think so. I don't think there's a single person that said, I'm not buying this game because I'm not supporting Wizards of the Coast, because they knew Wizards of the Coast wasn't making it, even though there was money exchanging hands, because you have to. You can't make a game like this without paying Wizards and Hasbro a lot of money. So Wizards got paid for Baldur's Gate 3. And so in many ways, if you are playing Baldur's Gate 3, you are in essence, in a way, supporting Wizards of the Coast, even tangentially, is just a matter of fact. And the fact that so many people bought this game, so many people are playing this game, and nobody is bringing up, at least I haven't seen in my circles, bringing up the controversy of should we support this game because it's 5e. And I think you nailed it there, commenting in how it may not affect Wizards of the Coast, the company. But when people look and go, oh, this is a Lorien game playing 5e, in many ways, it's a homebrew game that's a video game, because it's not directly being run by Wizards of the Coast. It's not released by Hasbro. It's an independent thing, and it's a small company. It was EA. I think it would be different. But the fact that it's a smaller company doing these things has gotten all this love. It might actually create a system when people are looking at other homebrew games and looking at other Wizards of the Coast third-party materials. So there's a decent possibility that the more we democratize fifth edition, the more people will divorce D&D from 5e and Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast. And they'll look at D&D and fifth edition as something that they own rather than something a corporation tries to impose. So I think the more we see the success of this game, it might spin around and boost the sales of potentially third-party 5e games that are still 100% compatible with D&D. There's a possibility. God knows I would love that to happen, because that's basically my career.
Mm. Yeah, well, and I think a lot of people, and as I've been going through all the versions of Dungeons and Dragons, I've now played Beck Me Dungeons and Dragons, and I've played a 3.5 and 4E and
Yeah.
Pathfinder, and one of the things you start to realize, and even looking at some of the old AD&D rules, is that 5E is a compilation of all of them,
Yeah,
like
it's an amalgamation of
you
30
know,
years of gaming.
yeah, so it's and it's just in its current permutation, really, and whether people like that permutation is another thing. But it's all those rules have always existed. They just haven't been in that particular permutation right now until now.
Yeah.
And of course, Wizard of the Coast is apparently trying to adjust that. I think it'll be a test of time to see what happens with our community, because this community, people assume that you can do certain things and things will happen a certain way. But the reality is that, like all communities, they're made up of people. And when people know that they're being manipulated, or somebody's doing something they don't like or they do like, they respond sometimes in predictable manners, but sometimes, because they're human, they're not pigeons. My area of expertise is psychology. Pigeons you can predict. Very, very rarely do they do something strange and unexpected. But as soon as humans know that they're being, looked at, they do the wackiest, strangest things. They really do, because they know they're being observed. So I think our community will probably respond in some very unusual ways that we weren't predicting.
Well, there's I mean, back then we had a schism between the people who said, like, I was part of the group that was championing the support of fifth edition, almost to spite Wizard of the Coast, to basically democratize the system and give it, which ultimately what Wizard ended up doing. They basically handed it to the public, but there is still this contingent of people that will not play 5e or even D&D because of their hate with wizards. And maybe in your circles, I haven't been seeking these people out, but I'm in a lot of communities and I haven't heard a single peep of someone that says, I refuse to buy Baldur's Gate 3 because I hate Wizards of the Coast. I have not heard that. So I'm starting to think that the real 5e haters that are still hating on Wizards of the Coast and 5e as a side effect are not really as numerous nowadays as we think. I think that there are way more people who just want to play D&D and don't want to get into the politics.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think I've had one person mention it to me in a forum on Discord, and that was it. But everybody else, I haven't really heard that sort of thing. One of the things I did get a lot of, and it's interesting because for some reason that Dungeons and Dragons movie, Honor Among Thieves, was very much associated as being a thing that was funded by Wizards of the Coast, which it really wasn't. It was Paramount. Paramount was there to make all the money, and they really put in all this money into it.
I have a
Um,
suspecting reason, by the way, that may not be true. Some people
yeah.
are saying the fact that this film bombed, and I have actually asked the fact that because Hasbro's name is at the beginning of the film,
Mm,
Hasbro's name pops up during like the opening stuff, Paramount, Hasbro, and you don't get a name like that unless you have skin in the game. I personally believe, and there's never been evidence of this, but I'm almost 100% certain that the actual budget of this film was partially covered by Hasbro. And I think the reason why the budget got to $150 million is that Hasbro put skin in the game. So there's been talk already about potentially having a sequel depending on how well it does on streaming. And it's doing very well on streaming, I might add.
mm,
That if we suddenly see Paramount looking to make a sequel to it, I think that'll be proof positive that it may, even though people said they lost 50 or $60 million, I go, yeah, but I don't think Paramount fronted all the money. And we think of films like Titanic. And Titanic was like made Fox a bunch of money and go, they didn't make that much money because Paramount actually funded a good chunk of that money as well. It was split between the two of them. So I don't think we truly understand.
mm.
And you want to know a good example of this? There was a film a very long time ago called The Golden Compass,
Yes, I know it.
which was a very well-known film. I think a really good film. It was actually remade as a 3-season TV series just recently on HBO. But the first book was turned into a movie, a big budget movie by New Line Cinema. Same people did Lord of the Rings. This film cost about 150, $160 million, made about $400 million worldwide, which you would think would be a perfect excuse to do a sequel. But a sequel never happened. In fact, Golden Compass killed New Line Cinema. It got shut down not long after this because of a single mistake, and that's because part of the film was funded by international distributors who wanted to they raised money by selling the film into distribution. So New Line Cinema got some money from Alliance Atlanta, which is a Canadian company, and a few other companies. So they got the film, got to release it in their theaters, and they got to keep the money. So that was the trade-off. New Line Cinema was banking that they would make profit in the American market. So they saved, so they took a bunch of money from a bunch of different companies and let them release it in their territories. Turns out Golden Compass was a massive hit internationally. So Alliance, all these other international production companies that only spent money, that didn't have any fingers in the production itself, got to make bank. But New Line Cinema ended up losing millions and millions of dollars because the film tanked in America. And if New Line had funded the film entirely themselves and grabbed all the money internationally, they would have pulled a profit and we would have seen a sequel. So this is a situation where this pops up, but people didn't know that. And people wondered years later, why didn't we see a sequel to a successful movie? And then the word got out, the fact that New Line went out of business because they sold the distribution rights to all these other companies in order to cover the budget. So I wouldn't be surprised if there is a profit sharing between Hasbro. And in many ways, Hasbro can look at this and go, we're going to give you 25 million. You can keep the profit because we want the exposure of the brand. The brand exposure is worth that much money. So I wouldn't be surprised if the actual money that Paramount invested was a lot less.
And I guess, I mean, look, very quickly, I'll go over the movie stuff. I had a lot of people approach me, and I saw a lot of people say, look, they were fans of Dungeons and Dragons, but because of the OGL, they had told all their family and all of their friend network not to go. And so when people think, oh, why did that movie not do well? There was a very concerted effort by some influential people who potentially had anywhere from 5 to 30 people who would have gone to that movie with them that just didn't go because
But
they
looking back at the
boycotted
Flash
it.
and so forth, is there $100 million worth of those people? That's the question.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
And I
Well,
guess
that's
we can never know. I guess for
yeah.
me, my theaters when I went was full, and a lot of people enjoyed it.
Mm,
Talking specifically about the movie and then using that as a way to get back to Baldur's Gate,
yes.
I find it interesting that, as I mentioned before, Baldur's Gate 3 doesn't break from the mold. It's presented narratively, structurally very similar to all the other previous games, including a Dragon Age, where, and let's be 100% honest, it is very hammy. It is very melodramatic. It is very operatic. It is boisterous. It is wordy and
Cheesy.
cheesy. Characters are not subdued; they overact. And if you watched, and even you watched the good version like Dragon Age, which also had voice support, and watching these videos, I'm like, oh my god, these people like. And there's a part of me that went, there were some people that didn't like Honor Among Thieves, and they're probably saying, looking at Baldur's Gate, and go, that's the TV series or movie I want. And my response to that is, really? You want that? If this game, Baldur's Gate 3, someone said, oh my God, this is like it's written by the same people who did Honor Among Thieves. It doesn't take itself too seriously. It's funny, it's light, it's campy. I'm like, sign me up. I want to play this game. I want to see how it breaks that mold. But watching the playthroughs, I'm like, nope, it is exactly what you would expect. It takes itself incredibly seriously. It does not hide its melodrama at all. And this is the reason why when I was looking at these videos, I was like, my God, I really dislike the sword and sorcery fantasy genre when it sticks to its stereotypes. When it's glued to its stereotypes, it's such a hard thing to read or watch. It's so clumsy.
Mm, yeah, but then cheese is always, cheese is good on pizza. It's just not good with anything else. You know what I mean? There's the only time that cheese works is on a pizza.
Yeah, and a good example of that is the fact that this is something I wanted to spin off as well, talking about the specifics of the game, what we can learn from it.
Mm,
The fact that you can romance a lot of different characters in Baldur's Gate. You really couldn't romance characters in the previous games. It was never something that was typical. And I don't know whether or not you and I talked about, or whether or not you've done a round table of romance in games. And because I put in romance in my games, but it's very, very situational. and I really dance around it a lot, but I try to insert it in at some point. So there's a romantic subplot usually in all my campaigns. Um, and the only game I've ever seen that ever wrote a romantic subplot that didn't make you just groan would be going back to Mass Effect. Mass Effect had very well
Oh,
written romantic subplots.
yes, I remember. Yeah, I've played Mass
Tally all,
Effect. I know.
tally all the way. Anyway, but this game it follows that same formula that would Dragon Age use, where you're giving gifts and stuff, and it becomes a very much a transactional situation where your love interest it's more of another thing to conquer. And I was a little upset when I started seeing I literally did see videos that compile all of the videos for a Pacific romantic love interest and going, wow, this is really awkward. And there have been some people who have been commenting on some of the relationships and said that like the most popular relationship, according to a lot of people, is this relationship with a Gith Yankee, which people don't know are trans-dimensional people that lay eggs. But let's get around that little physical incompatibility for now. There is a romantic subplot, it's actually the largest romantic subplot in the game. If you pursue the relationship with this Yankee, and there have been articles talking about how incredibly toxic this relationship actually is, and people aren't really paying attention to it because it's the exotic romantic relationship in the game that you want to pursue. But I read an article about this is the worst person you want to romance because it is such a toxic relationship.
Yeah. Look, I've only done that sort of thing a couple of times in my tabletop role-playing games, and I did it in the Star Wars Saga game, and made the player very beetroot red, basically, and everybody else was laughing their head off. I don't really do that very much now because I find either people like one person will like it and the rest of the table feels uncomfortable, or one person feels really uncomfortable and everybody's laughing at the situation and them potentially. So I just don't go there
I
anymore.
tend to do them on side scenes. Like I'll write a script on a narrative, and I'll give it to a character for him to read, and then he makes a little thing. Because most of the time, romantic stories don't happen in a crowd. So a lot of times these are private moments. So sometimes I will set aside the player, or very often, one time I literally wrote a kind of a choose your own adventure, and I had stuff written for them, and so they got to pursue that relationship without the stigma from the group, um, and and people are like, "You two are together? Yeah. When did that happen? None of your damn business. It's not meant for community vote." And so that's how I present that. That's another thing, but that's one of the things people may go, "Oh my god, romantic interest. We get to
Yeah.
do all that." And Amethyst is it has a very, I would say, erotic underpinnings. There's this level of romanticism that permeates the setting a lot of people don't know about. That if you read it, it's in there. And I make a point of saying, this is how, almost indirectly, this is how you bang the various people in this setting. The new book Revelations has a species called Vispid, and Vispids are little fairies about this big, right? Actually, they're all a foot tall. They have a couple interesting little tweaks that make them a little different. One thing is that they get bonuses to strength, so a Vispid can have a 20 strength, this big. And so the image that Nick drew is a Vispid holding up like a 2-ton rock, and I go into detail. Okay, fine. Now, how do we get now? Now, how can people bang these things? And so I created a rule structure: the fact that they can something called form flux, when they can achieve a full humanoid form for a period of time, because they, like everybody else, basically needs to be able to reproduce. So I needed to find a way to run them to reproduce with, like all elves, cross species wise. So I wrote this whole form flux rule system basically to allow you to bang a fairy. And and the thing is, as you said, this game, Baldur's Gate, is filled with romantic subplots, but we know it's a very awkward, seldomly seen thing. And despite how often I try to encourage it through my game, through subtext in the story, I know that most players are like, I'm sure that someone's gonna probably send me a message going, "Dude, are you really horny?" Because there's so much sexual subtext in your story that you just always underneath the surface. There's tons of side stories of romantic interest. I have segments of fictional books that talk about these love affairs between these characters. it's filled with them, and I'm like, and yet I tell those stories because I know that in the game you're never going to see any of that because most GMs don't want to bother. So this is one of those things where expectations come into play. It's like, oh my god, I get to romance all these different characters, and you get to a GM, he's like, no, we're
Hmm.
not going to be doing that.
Yeah.
No
Well,
way.
here's the thing. Look, for those of you who are starting to feel like I should have switched off, I'm gonna make. I think one, Chris, the fact that you have actually come up with a mechanic in a game that involves banging and banging somebody else is hilarious. I'm not, I don't really get too worried about it. I've seen people talking about it's very inappropriate to have something like this in a role-playing game, and I'm like, it might, it depends on the sort of group that you're dealing with, and it depends on the people that you're talking about. It really, it's none of the wider community's real business how
Well,
how you
I'll tell
play
you,
the game.
yeah.
But what I love is that you've done this. Larian's put it into their video game, Baldur's Gate 3, and there's no way that Wizards of the Coast would ever do something like this because they know it's like a landmine of social media poison that would descend upon them, and their sanitization and censorship department would just go into overdrive. So it's I think
Well, yeah,
it's hilarious.
there's a famous book about sex in D&D that was banned and kicked off of platforms. It's very difficult to find. They also went about their promotion and their concept kind of the wrong way. I think there are ways to have an erotic supplement for D&D and still do it tastefully. But very specifically, the advantage of having romance in a D&D game is that you ultimately have people talking to other people, and hopefully, if they're not completely self-enclosed, um, you know, introverts, which unfortunately, because D&D, a lot of them are, um, there's a possibility for actually having an organic relationship that does develop in a way that you can perceive to be realistic. But because Baldur's Gate 3 is a rules hard system with mechanics and so forth, they, like other games, created a mechanical system that you have to employ in order to win over the favors. Now, Baldur's Gate 3 does a lot of stuff that's role playing wise, but there is still situations where you have to roll persuasion to get some to progress in a plot point with a character that will win them favor. This is one thing I appreciate about Mass Effect, specifically the two most popular relationships in Mass Effect, which is Tali and Garrus. You couldn't romance them in the first game, so you literally had to be friends with them for nearly 40 hours before you could develop a relationship, which is something you never see in most games. It's like 20, like there's a romantic subplot and it's like 30 minutes total. I'm like, really? That's it? That's how much?
Mm.
That's all you need. And when you look at like Tally from Mass Effect and you look at that compilation, it's 7 hours. You go like, that's insane. That doesn't even account for the intermediate dialogue you get with that person. So with this game is once again, if you were to say about politics and controversy, I think Baldur's Gate creates a very unrealistic depiction of romantic stories in these stories because it comes off as being something that's transactional, something that involves rolling dice, where in truth, I've never ever seen a romantic subplot in a tabletop role playing game where you needed to roll dice to win someone over,
Well,
unless it was just mindless. You just wanted to seduce a bar wench or something like that, and then leave it at that,
yeah,
which a
yeah.
lot of them do.
Yes, yeah, and that's quite a common thing to see showing up in a game, or at least being attempted. I think the other thing that I find quite amusing too is, and I'm not giving Larian a hard time or Baldur's Gate 3. I still think it's quite amusing. Is that it kind of comes off as somebody walking down the street late at night, and they come across the prostitute, and it's a transaction
Witcher 3
to have the
absolutely turned
relationship.
that into an achievement. Witcher 3, there was only one romantic interest that was canon. Everything else was an achievement. You literally got cards and posters for having romanced them. They turned that part into a game, and we're fine. But people, I think smart people know like this. You're not going to see this in a role playing game because nobody in the right mind, even if it's a well written game, would present the romantic interest in this capacity.
Hmm. Okay, so now we know Baldur's Gate has ventured into a realm that Wizards of the Coast is probably incapable of coping with. Good for them. Whether it's done well or not, I guess they've done the best they can with it.
Mm-hmm.
Given it's a video game. And the other thing is, I'm like, I've seen people saying, "Oh, the D&D movie didn't save Dungeons and Dragons, and the Dungeons and Dragons brand is sort of losing momentum." And I'm not sure I completely agree with that because it's the only thing I can find in a game store to buy if I want a tabletop role playing game in New Zealand. I don't know what it's like anywhere else,
That's
but
basically the same. Unless
yeah,
it's a big game store, its
yeah.
role playing system is 80% D&D, 20% Pathfinder.
Yeah. I can't even find Pathfinder half the time. And I doubt that I will until, yeah, I don't know when. I had to have people send stuff to me. Uh, but I'm kind of curious, is like, do you think Dungeons and Dragons is really in trouble and needs, a bit more of a push, or is it doing fine and they're going to get a bigger push by having Boulder Gate show up, Baldur's Gate 3 show up? I don't
I
really
think
buy into
ultimately Baldur's
this.
Gate will help D&D. I think right now it might take a hit, but I think in the long run,
Yeah.
I think if Baldur's Gate had stumbled on its release, I think everyone would be saying the reason why Baldur's Gate 3 failed was because of Wizards of the Coast, because D&D as a brand is failing. I think that regardless of what the real reason is,
Mm,
if Baldur's Gate 3 had failed, I think most people would be attacking the brand in Wizards of the Coast for the cause of the failure
mm,
without changing the game. The game's exactly the same. But the fact it has begun to be the greatest game of the year and considered to be potentially the most successful game in the last few years and potentially setting a precedent for other people to follow going, we need to make our games more like this. So you mean more like the games from 20 years ago, just a bit with a bit more of a polish. I think that it's hard now to make the argument. I think it's possible that like if someone says D&D is failing, I go, I don't think so. I think there's a really successful game that's saying no, you're wrong, and so that is evidence that I think the D&D brand, regardless of what people think of Wizards, D&D as a brand, I think is recovering and will probably get to a point where it was a year ago, if not surpass, if Baldur's Gate continues this upwards trend, which is showing those signs of faltering. A lot of more people are getting it as more reviews come out, and of course, it's trending like 100% on Metacritic. I don't think it's trending very high with both fans and professional critics.
okay. Let's ask the big question because Wizards of the Coast is throwing millions of dollars at a three-dimensional virtual tabletop. And I would imagine they're probably trying to target 2024 with the release of their next lot of core rule books, right? They're probably trying to aim for 2024 to release the three-dimensional virtual tabletop. I have no idea if it's probably ready by then, but do you think that three-dimensional virtual tabletop that Wizards of the Coast is creating is going to take a hit? Is it going to really struggle with the existence of something like Baldur's Gate 3? I am inclined to think that it looks like antiquated technology compared to Baldur's Gate, and I kind of almost feel like Tailspire, which has been around longer, is probably done better than they have. So I don't know what they're thinking right now.
Well, I haven't seen a lot. I've seen a bit here and there, and considering how some of the things that they're promising, this might be like one of the best looking VTTs out there once they finally get their crap together. My only issue is that it may look so good that a lot of people's old machines may not run it properly, but that's
Mm,
another conversation. Now, if the VTT came out around give or take a month plus or minus from the Baldur's Gate release, I think that would be really poor timing. I think that's a lot of people are going to be playing the VTTs or Baldur's Gate, and they're going to make a decision. And right now, they would have chosen Baldur's Gate. But if they release it, the VTT next summer or next fall, and there's been some rumors running around that it may be as late as next fall, if not even early 2025 when it's 100%, because it takes a while for these things. It takes like for a game, really, a game takes 3 or 4 years or more. I think by the time that happens, the polish would have been wiped off of Baldur's Gate, and they can stand on their own, unless, of course, they follow it up with DLCs. Like once again, if they're putting out modules for Baldur's Gate 3 for the next year, Wizards are going to start thinking maybe this was not a good idea. And I'm going to be really interested if they say there is no DLC planned for Baldur's Gate. because once again, DLC is cash money. Even Witcher and Cyberpunk did it. If we don't see any DLC and they say there's no DLC for Baldur's Gate, we'll say they were contracted to not. Because I think if they were putting out DLC every few months for the next year, it's going to continue keeping that IP, Baldur's Gate specifically, and that game up, and that may impact the VTT. But if there isn't, I think the VT is fine.
So they just released, apparently, well, we were supposed to be releasing 1,000 new changes and improvements to the game.
Oh
So
yeah,
they're
patches.
or patches or whatever the heck it was. Yeah. So I'm kind of curious. When I don't think it's been publicly disclosed what the price was for the licensing to Larian for them to
Oh
make
yeah,
Baldur's Gate
no
3.
one's going to say that out loud.
But I would also imagine there must be some sort of arrangement in terms of Wizards of the Coast. It may not have happened, but there might be some sort of arrangement for taking a percentage of their profit as well. I mean, not their gross, but their net profit, based off their
It's a
sales.
possibility,
It's
but
a possibility, but a
but
lot of license.
unfortunately, we're no one anyone that says yes or no is making things up. Like there's
Yeah,
literally no evidence here or there.
yeah,
Most of the time, at least with big companies, they have no desire to share revenue, but
mm,
sometimes they don't have a choice, especially if you're looking at Hollywood. Big celebrities, they get points. Basically, they get to make money off the top. Um, but that's only because they get to, like, they're the headliners. They're the headliners. They're the star of that movie. They can negotiate points. Curmudgeonly, they'll follow through. In fact, we're seeing strikes right now for writers and actors because they are refusing to give out those profit sharing. So when a company wants to buy the rights of something, they're looking to have those exclusivity and not share in the profits. So it'll be really interesting, considering Laria is not EA, it's not Blizzard, that there could be a situation that you're right, that there is some percentage. But as you said, I don't think we'll ever know that.
yeah. But also too, Larian hasn't exactly made like nothing. I mean, before Baldur's Gate 3, they've made some pretty impressive games. So, I believe it's Destiny. These games were quite quite complicated,
No, I think
quite
you're thinking
involved.
of Divinity. Like
Is it,
Destiny
oh,
was
is
done
it,
by Bungie.
yeah, Divinity. Yeah, Divinity. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, they do Divinity, Beyond Divinity, Divinity 2, Divinity Dragon Commander, Divinity Original Sin, a lot of Divinity games.
Hmm,
But
hmm.
the thing is, it should be noted, that's all they've done. Like they are really known for that one series of games. They've done educational games, but that is really it. They are Divinity 100% full, through and through. That's basically been their bread and butter for the last almost 10 years.
Hmm. Yeah, but those games have made them some pretty big bickies. So I can't imagine it. Yeah. Anyway, it's a moot point. We'll never know. We'll never know whether that's the case or not. So, I guess the other thing that I find interesting is somebody had approached me. I think this was yesterday actually, and asked me, "What's your opinion of the fact that it's now a bonus action in Baldur's Gate 3 to drink a healing potion, whereas in the standard 5e game, it's an action?" And I said, well, a lot of people have a homebrew rule that says bonus action can be used to drink a healing potion. Not in my game, and none of the game masters in my home group do that because we've all agreed that that's just ridiculous. We're just not going to do that in our own games, but people do. So that yeah, it's another example of the fact that there are some homebrew, there are some variations in terms of the formula that 5e was in this video game.
I think that brings up actually a bigger kind of topic that I really like about not just the rules themselves that they've altered, which we know, as we talked about, that they already have with some of these altered. I don't have an issue with that. If the official rule came out and that was it, I don't generally have my characters, my players are not explicit with potions. Usually they have to rely on spellcraft or their own hit dice. But no, this is not like a game when a character has a bag of holding with 50 healing potions in it. But so as a result, if that rule was in place, I really wouldn't care. That being said, from a realistic point of view, it kind of doesn't make any sense because you basically have to take something out, pull the stopper off, and then down it. So it seems like that should technically take up more time than a bonus action.
Mm.
But I'm curious about other things that the game did, maybe not necessarily mechanically within the 5e structure that we can learn from. And some of them are more jokingly. The fact that um, this game, like many others, have exploding barrels. And I've never once in my life seen an exploding barrel in real life, and I haven't seen an exploding barrel in a tabletop role-playing game. But we seem to see it a lot in games, and they show up in here as well. The and I thought that was interesting. Other things that I liked was they obviously include boss battles. We know about boss battles. We have the rolling and the romantic interests. 1 second. Got some fluid in the wrong pipe there.
You had a barrel stuck in there. It was trying to explode.
Yeah. So, but there's something else that was interesting that another video game commentator focused his entire weekly episode about, and that is save scumming. Do you know what save scumming is?
No, you're going to have to explain this. I think you had mentioned in the email when you first contacted me something about save scumming.
So this is the one thing when we translate D&D into electronic terms, without even thinking of adaptations. D&D is what's called a roguelike. And that means the fact that characters create something, they create a character, they're in a linear, I'll say linear, but they're in an event where they can't save the game. They're playing it with their group, their DM's running the game, and if you die, you die. And there is very few situations where there are do-overs or so forth. And a lot of people say that's how D&D is played. Your character will die, and if they're dead, they are dead. They can't come back. And I know you've talked about this at length with some of the roundtables. And I have said, in my game, my players rarely ever die because there's no narrative reason to kill them off. But some players I have literally played with that said, I want that random chance to kill me because that means I take ownership of my life. If I know I'm never going to die, I'll be unrealistic in my actions. I go, yes, but at the end of the day, this is a fun game. And I'm not in the mood to kill off a character and then that player having to create a new character that would introduced, unless there's some reason, unless players do something so incredibly stupid that it doesn't work out in their favor. And in this game, yes, you can potentially permanently kill non-player characters, and then they're gone. They don't show up again. You can literally. There's a video I just saw before we started talking, where somebody killed every single person they encountered in Baldur's Gate. Every single NPC, which apparently you can do, which is kind of effed up. But despite that, D&D has always been about that permanence. Now, save scumming is when if you do something and there's an element of random chance that it doesn't work in your favor, even if you don't die, you reload that save to replay that moment and try it again. One of the games that personified this was XCOM, because XCOM is a turn-based game with percentages. So if you miss a 98% chance shot that you really need to make, you go, I'll just reload that save, takes like 10 seconds, and you make that shot again until you finally hit. In fact, there's an option in the game that says turning off save scumming, because you can turn off that option so you can't do that, because people were insisting that they be allowed to. And so in this game, there has been a topic of save scumming, with players are saying you should never, ever save scum playing Baldur's Gate. You should let the dice roll and go with the flow. And yes, some people have said, yes, but there are some situations when I'm making a very bad roll on something I should be able to make. And we've talked about reliable skills before, and it completely screws the entire situation. And someone says, you know what? No, I would much rather succeed. So they go back, reload their save, and try that again. And obviously, we'll get situations when the main character dies. The game is over. You have to reload an earlier save to continue that game. You don't have to go, I have to start the whole game over again with a new character and re-roll a brand new storyline because my character failed. And I think one of the things that most critical things I think game designers and GMs and players can learn from Baldur's Gate is taking that permanence that's been plaguing D&D since day one and creating an environment where people don't have to worry about the permadeath of their character, where if there's a total party kill, like why not have checkpoints Why not have the GM say, okay, guys, at this point, just before you enter this final room, you've passed a checkpoint. And you could play with this as much as you want. You could take photocopies of your character if you want, or just simply remember where your numbers are at and write your new numbers on another sheet. So if the party all dies, okay, we're going to load up our save game. We're going back to the checkpoint. We're going to try that again. I think that there's a significant value in a tabletop game that employs that as a homebrew mechanic. I think it's probably the most valuable takeaway from Baldur's Gate, in my opinion, when it comes to homebrew rules, is taking away the idea of permanence and allowing players and the GM potentially to reload moments to try it again if the players believe that they screwed up. I open the door to you.
Well, we've had this conversation. I'm going to be as quick as I can. I don't I don't give a shit about save scumming in a video game. I don't think that it has to be run a particular way. I really have no. It doesn't affect me. I don't play those games anyway. And even if I did, I still wouldn't care. I frankly don't care when people do that in a tabletop game. You know, when they decide to play a tabletop game and somebody died, we're going to just reset it, or the whole party wiped out, we'll reset it. But then again, you know my approach to character death. I don't make the decision about character death, and when I'm playing a tabletop role playing game. I've always seen as like, oh, if you die, you don't have to start all over again. We just continue on. I mean, I know a lot of people think, oh, if you die, okay, you just got to start all over again. I'm like, it's not really what I was thinking. Like, well, you can play another character, but you don't have to play another character. Like everything is just a transition. Can't count the number of characters that have died, and people have said to me, I want to keep playing this character, Fred. Well, can you bring it back to life? No, you don't have magic. Fine. Let's come up with some reason, and I'll come up with a couple of options, and we bring the character back. And my home group, when characters die, I get the chant. They love this. They love this. Reincarnate. They just start chanting reincarnate, reincarnate. They want the role. They want the character to come back as some other race. And it's usually for them, it's hilarious. Sometimes it causes untold stress and strain for the person, because it breaks the character they had built in the first place, because now they were an elf before, and now they're a dwarf or a gnome, and like, you got to be kidding. But then again, it doesn't bother me, because I do
the irony for me
retraining
is
as
that
well.
I stripped out in my games. I strip out raise. The only spell I keep is Revivify,
Hmm.
because Revivify has this logical thing, because it's like 5 minutes, and people who die in real life can be brought back after 5 minutes. So I kind of I allow Revivify because I think it's a really good spell, and even in my revisions with Amethyst, with my canonical spellcaster that's being introduced, that Revivify was always present. But even in the original game, where I was modifying the wizard rather than just allowing it to go in whole cloth, I said spells from 7th, 8th, and ninth were foundation spells. They were artifacts. You had to hunt them down, which means if you did not have a foundation artifact, you could not cast any spells from 7, 8, or 9. You were basically limited to spell levels 1 through 6, and then if you got an artifact, you got that one spell, and so you would maybe have 2 or 3 spells that were 7, 8, or 9, and among them was Raise Dead, Resurrection, True Resurrection, which means these were rare artifacts, which means Raise Dead and Resurrection were not on the table for players, which means if they died, Resurrection Reincarnate was generally not on the table, so they did not have that as an option. I wanted to take that agency out of the setting, not necessarily out of the game itself, but out of the setting. I didn't want resurrection to be in the setting, and that still applies. However, as I said, most of the time when I run games, I create narratives. So we're not really in a lot of situations where the players can die. And I said, in my last 20 years of gaming, I've only had about 3 characters actually die. And they did that through their actions, not because they rolled a 1. Like I said this to you before in the previous video. I've never will kill a character because they rolled a 1 on a save. I think it's so cheap. I think it doesn't need to be in D&D. But I like the idea of introducing a homebrew rule where you employ checkpoints. This character died, guys. Do you want to continue, or do you want to reset and try this whole battle over again? Maybe do something different. And it's a meta thing, so it's not affecting the setting or your narrative. You're simply taking the mechanics and go, okay, players, Do we reset this encounter and try again? And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think there's something to learn. And the same thing with cheesing. And people thing is, considering that people cheese already in tabletop, cheesing for people who don't know is when you're taking advantage of a video game's mechanics or loophole or a bug in order to gain something in the game that you would not normally get. And people do that all the time. They figure out ways to max. They're called min maxers. We see it all the time. So why not bring in other elements from video games that we talk about? And I think playing around with saving checkpoints or removing that permanence is something that's very important.
Yeah, look, as you know, I mean, I don't really, I'm not really about, and most of the videos I've ever done aren't really about, oh, you should do character death this way. So for me, whether it's tabletop game or it's a video game, I just think there should be plenty of options so that the group can choose and the game master decides how they would like that system to be run, and whatever the system they decide with their group is the way they do it. I do it a particular way. I just decide not to even be part of that parcel anymore. Other people do it differently. That's fine with me because I'm not part of their group, so it's not an issue for me. So yes, what I would be nice to see happen with Baldur's Gate, if they really wanna, if they're watching this video, which I very much doubt, if they really want to take the scope of character death to another level, is when your character dies, you get to bring in another character, a different character at the same level that you were before, or maybe a level down or whatever it is, and you continue with a different character through the story. Or you can bring the character back, but they got reincarnated as a gremlin or something like that. I mean, whatever the heck you want to do. I always used to have all sorts of things come up. I've had people come back in the game. They wound up as a big pile of poo at one point. Other people wound up in the bodies of various individuals that just happened to be around at the time because there was no body left for them to actually have their spirit reside in. I've had people come back and they were just their skeleton was moving around. There's no flesh left. So somebody.
One of the craziest example of this, going back to video gaming again, BioShock Infinite. A lot of people don't realize how BioShock Infinite dead. Like video, being a first-person shooter, there's tons of situations where you die, you just reload, you come back, you try that level again. They're called checkpoints. BioShock Infinite did it very clever. It's actually in setting. Now, BioShock Infinite deals with parallel realities. It deals with a character that is going to try to save a girl, go through, and then she ends up moving through parallel realities. And so you hop through parallel realities. And at one point, you realize that you are potentially not the first person that's gone on this. At one point, you see these two characters, the Lutece twins, who are the ones orchestrating this, and they see a list of these choices, left or right, and there's like 60 choices, and then they give you that choice, and you choose one, and they go, "Oh, that's a new change," and they put it next to the one, and you realize you are probably the 75th version of this person that's been trying this story. And so when you die, if you die in most ways, you get this quick cinematic of your companion character, which is with you all the time, basically doing a quick patch so you wake up. So you're basically not reloading, you're just getting up because she's tending to your injuries and you're standing up. So that's their in-universe way. She's basically, so time is not changing, you're not reloading. If, however, you die and she's not there, or you die in a fashion that she can't, if you get thrown off like a building, she quickly catches you. So even there, they create this cinematic so that you're still the singular character. If you die and she's not there, or there's no way for her to have helped you, then you get this new cinematic, which shows a quick second of the first seconds of the game when you go through this door. You go through this door and you rejoin at that moment. And I realized that is the game's way of saying, oh no, that person's dead forever. This is a new version of you that's done exactly the same thing up until this point. Maybe this person will survive. And that's when I realized that they used death as a plot point and used the mechanics of a first-person shooter and made it a setting point in the game, which is ingenious because that same person did a very similar thing in BioShock 1. So I thought that was very, very interesting that you could say, okay, guys, parallel universe, you got right to this encounter. Maybe this parallel group of players will do things better. But that group of characters, they're all dead. This is a parallel universe. You're all here before, 5 seconds before you're all died. Maybe this parallel reality will work better for you. So I thought that was a very interesting idea. And I think once again, GMs could play around with that in their settings if they so desire.
Mm. Have you played Fate by any chance?
Fate.
Fate, Fudge, Fate, that game system.
No, no. Oh, Fate Core, like Fate. Oh,
Yeah.
um, ironically, I have books for that system. Amethyst is out for Fate. I did not write it. Christopher Stilson did the adaptation for Fate. I've seen tabletop with Will Wheaton do a Fate session.
Mm.
I really have very little to no experience with it. Even though I did the layout for Amethyst Fate, I have no experience with the Fate system, other than it's popular.
So the Fate system is not as popular as you might think, but because otherwise people will be making more videos on it. But in any case, I've played Fate, and Fate has an interesting way of dealing with when a character goes down. Uh, you could say they died, but usually in Fate, what happens is if you wind up with not able to function anymore, you are knocked out, which means you are out of the adventure for one scene, or you might be knocked out and out of the adventure for one scene, plus you have a complication. You lost an arm or an eye or a leg or something like that, and you wind up with a prosthetic limb or something like that. So it builds this concept in that the more your character gets banged up to the point where they would normally die, they don't actually die. They just simply come back with another scar or a missing limb or a more complicated situation than it was before, to sort of represent the fact that they are getting banged up as much as they are. So, I mean, you could do that in a tabletop role-playing game easy because it's done in Fate. I know people do it in 5e and D&D, and it would be kind of cool if they did it in Baldurs Gate 3 too. So that's another way of sort of looking at it. There's consequences for going down, but those consequences aren't just death. You just keep playing.
Yeah, that's another good solution. I said most of the time that's the reason why the subject of safe scumming came up recently with Baldur's Gate, was because there is a group of people that say how you play your own video game is entirely your damn business. No one else should tell you how to play your own game.
Yeah.
And then people who insist on sticking their noses in other people's businesses. But at the end of the day, it's your game. Play it the way you want to play it, which is the slogan of a video series I do with Dave Townsend. And ultimately, it's up to you. It's up to you how you want to do it. I'm just simply saying the fact that Baldur's Gate 3 allows that, because they could have made the game in such a way where you couldn't, where
Yeah.
everything was permanent. And the fact that they allowed save scumming, they allowed that, means the fact that they're there to make sure you're having fun. You're not just like everything was going well and then a random D20 roll destroyed the entire campaign for me. Ultimately, at the end of the day, I think they were right to allow it, because at the end of the day, it's up to the player if they want to use it or not. But I think this could set a precedent, hoping creating a situation where players don't have to feel as if their pen and paper characters are as volatile, mortal.
Yeah, another reason to do something like that is when you invest so many hours in a story-based adventure, going and playing through the same story too many times, it gets depressing and annoying and frustrating for people. And so that's why you have saves. That's why you have save checkpoints and
Yeah.
so forth.
And roguelikes are generally short, and a campaign can be very long. I would hate to run a game for a year and then have your character die and go, well, that was all that time wasted. Now, in a way, I'm picking a new character, but this is a brand new person. I spent a year attaching myself emotionally, in many ways people do, to the people that they've created. They're assuming that personality, they're inhabiting that person. And you're basically, in many ways, inflicting trauma that you basically killed this person's creation. And they don't really have much of a say in it sometimes. And so that's why I think it's a little mean for GMs to do that.
Sounds a little melodramatic to me, there, Chris. But then
I
again,
have seen players cry.
I know, and I have too. And I have
I
too.
have seen players cry.
And that's why I always leave it to the players to decide whether they make a new character or they play the same character.
I
That's
totally
why,
agree.
because I just don't want to go through that situation where I have to watch a grown man or woman crying at my table because their character died because they wanted to keep playing it, and it died because they rolled a 1 on their death saving throw, or they just rolled 1s and 2s all night, and I kept rolling 20s, which doesn't happen very often, but it can. So yeah. Your comment on about the exploding barrels in, in a video game. I don't know what it is about exploding barrels, because you're right. Every video game I've ever seen, there's an exploding barrel. And I just
Yeah,
want to know, do you think maybe the exploding barrel in a video game is related to the same strange physiology, the same physics as American movies where there's a car and every time something hits them, they explode? They don't just catch on fire, they literally explode in this great huge ball of flame.
I'm old enough to remember a film called The Last Action Hero, which came out the same time as Jurassic Park and bombed as a result. And it was a spoof of action films. And at one point, when Arnold Schwarzenegger's character is in the real world, and he goes, "Here's another explosion for you, kid," and he shoots like constantly in the back of this vehicle and just makes holes in it. He's staring at it, shocked, and it turns to this kid who's like, "What were you expecting to happen?" But yeah, I think there's a little bit of that. There's also a little bit of the kind of visceral enjoyment of seeing something chain react and explode. Um, I actually think it was hilarious. I actually have rules in Ultramodern about sympathetic, about which explosives will set off other explosives. Like, can you shoot a grenade and have it blow up like every movie? No, you can't. You can't actually, shooting a grenade doesn't blow it up. That's not how grenades work, stuff like that. So like grenades, for example, aren't sympathetic. They don't blow up in another explosion. So, and I know that because I had somebody named Jeffrey Lamb who worked for the Explosive Ordnance Detail Division of the US Army fact check all of my work. To this day, I want to add, to this day, even now, there is a military advisor listed in my credits. His name is Jeffrey Lamb. He he came on board and say, "Hey, you want some help? I have some experience in explosives, and I can help you with these rules." And this was back in fourth edition stuff. I said, "Absolutely." I had him sign an NDA so that and a little agreement that says what he's writing is going to be exclusive to me. And he said, "No problem." I got the facts, and then it has the thing I sent to him, his signature, and I saw the banner of the facts at the top, and it said U.S. Army Explosive Ordnance Detail Division. And I was like, okay, then I guess he knows his stuff, and I never questioned him about it. And every single section, all the subsequent books that involved explosives, I've always had his credit because my rules have always been based off of what he told me, and that's why I have certain explosives that are sympathetic, how they explode, the vector. I have rules about explosives that will adjust depending on how you do things. So it's not just a spherical explosion. If you have an explosion in a hallway, it will stretch down the hallway accordingly. And I have all these rules because of Jeffrey Lamb. So I still have to this day a military advisor on my game to add that layer of authenticity. But yes, there are explosive barrels in Baldur's Gate 3.
Yes, and so did he include in his advice to you on exploding things? Did he include if you shoot a barrel, it explodes? I'm assuming it wasn't there.
Well, no, but there is a section on, because usually the barrels will fill. It's not just a barrel that just explodes. Like, you can't just blow up a wine barrel. You can't just blow up a barrel of mead. Um, the barrels are filled with something, and most of the time they're like fuel or or gunpowder for some strange reason. And with mine specifically, I actually will state which explosives are sympathetic. Because auto fuel and jet fuel have completely different explosive points, and so it's way easier to light car fuel on fire. It is really difficult to light airplane fuel on fire, because airplane fuel needs, like, it's just the way it works. If you see a pool of airplane fuel and you throw a match on it, it's not going up. I found that out from a friend who works at the airport, and don't know why I know that.
Yes, I remember because what high performance race cars use jet fuel sometimes, don't they?
Yeah.
And that stuff, when it does catch on fire, it's really hard to put out.
Yeah, that's
Really
the other
hard.
thing.
And you can't see it. You can't see the flames. You can feel it, but you just can't see it. So somebody's running around and you're like, what's going on? They're on fire. Okay. Okay, so is there anything else we need to discuss about Baldur's Gate 3? I think we have beaten this horse to death. I don't think there's much more we can go over, but if you have something else you would like to talk about.
I did find the rules. Here are the explosive ordnance rules for me. So yeah, if you're using, so jet fuel is sympathetic, which means it will blow up in another one, but auto fuel will, but composition explosives won't. So if you have like C4 and you shoot it or light it on fire, it will not explode. you actually need an ignition sword. So there are rules for everything. So demolitions need an explosive to blow up, except for a couple which need specifically an ignition. And then all the grenades need a quote detonator, otherwise they won't explode. And no grenade has sympathetic rules. So you can't blow up a grenade with anything other than an ignition source within that grenade. Just to put a polish and a cap on this podcast.
Hey, Chris, thank you for doing this with me. It's been entertaining. These conversations always are. And I don't know how useful they are to people, but hopefully they're able to take some of the ideas that we've discussed today away and either think about them a bit, or maybe not necessarily change their opinion, but maybe they'll implement them into their own games. Some of the
Room
things
for
we've sort of
discussion.
suggested. Yeah, yeah. There's room for movement.
So with that,
We're done.
okay.